This is your weekly reminder that here at the Marshfield Church of Christ, we're committed to glorifying God and uplifting one another through worship, spiritual growth, outreach, fellowship, and service to the community. And we believe that this mission is accomplished by loving God and loving one another. I mentioned before, one of my favorite authors is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is an interesting fellow. He is best known for the things that he wrote. He was a professor. He was a minister. He was also a spy in Nazi Germany during World War II. And he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And in the early parts of that book, he talks about something he calls cheap grace versus costly grace. The way he defines cheap grace is grace that you feel like you didn't do anything at all that is deserved to you just by who you are. He contrasts this with costly grace, which is grace that that is earned, but it's grace that is due to someone because they understand what was necessary in order for that grace to be given. He says there's kind of two cheap graces. The first one, there's the type of cheap grace that you think that you do not have to live your life in such a way to respond to the grace that's been given to you. I think back to a church in Louisville, Kentucky, and there's a guest book there, and it says, by signing this guest book, your salvation in heaven is promised forever and can never be lost. So that's one end of the cheap grace. There's another part of it too, though. There's another type of cheap grace that creates a list of things that they feel that if I do X, Y, and Z, depending on what tradition you come from defines what that is, but something along the lines of, you don't do bad things, you give money to the church, you attend services, and you sing. As long as you do those things, then you will be rewarded at the end of time. Bonhoeffer says both of those kind of two extremes, the list making and the doing nothing, are both cheap grace. That true discipleship, costly grace, is due to those people who have a true transformation because of the grace that has been given to us through Jesus. And that's the type of grace that we should strive for. Not that we've earned it, but because the grace that we have received transforms every aspect of the lives which we have. And he bases much of the book from here in Luke 14. Jesus is challenging people and teaching them what it's like to be real disciples. And I can't think of a better way to get people to change at least their line of thinking to hate your family. Now, this isn't a question as, do you hate your family? Although, we'll talk about that after services. Now, you probably heard something along the lines of, well, this word doesn't actually mean hate. This word means to love less. Or this word means you don't give as much to. Or this word means that it's not as important. The word is miseo, and it means hate. It means to have an utter detest for something. It's the word we get misogynistic from. That's what the word means. Now, whenever we start applying it, it probably means closer to what people have said. But the word itself means hate. And maybe that's where we should start with this. Jesus calls people to change their way of thinking. And what better way in a society that has their entire life built around how you take care of one another. Turning that upside down and saying, hey, your priorities are different now, the shock value in that would change the way people think. Whenever Jesus said to hate your family, the biggest thing he wanted you to notice is the contrast between what your priorities are going to be going forward. If you want to say that you love God with your all and truly with everything that you have, if you've given everything up, there's not really anything left. I've said this before. I believe it is sinful to have God first in your life, because that implies there's things second in your life. If you truly have God as your goal, he's the only thing. And every single relationship that comes after that is based upon that relationship with God. For example, if I said, I love Cora the most, she's the first of all my wives, how do you think that would make her feel? Because that means you've still divided what your priorities are. Jesus is telling us that we need to change our priorities to the point where the way that you behave is completely different than you did before you started. And he moves next into talking about what that actually looks like. Between Cincinnati, Ohio, and I think it's Louisville, but it may be Lexington, there is this unfinished amusement park that's now rusted and barely anything left, because they had they'd managed to put some of the larger rides and start the supporting beams. They were able to afford to put the supporting beams. And they had someone who was helping supply them with the finances in order to build this. And at the end, there was going to be some profit sharing. Well, the one party who was supplying most of the money went bankrupt. So then you were left with a half-finished amusement park that really isn't good for much of anything. An amusement park that's unfinished isn't very helpful to anybody. Jesus here says, before you decide that you're going to become my disciple, before you decide that you're going to be one of my followers, you need to evaluate what type of person you're going to be going forward. Have you understood the cost of what it means to be one of my followers? And if you haven't, you need to understand what you're going to do instead. He goes on to also describe a king who looks at how he's going to be able to fight this battle. And that if you figure out that you're not going to be able to win the battle, you probably should send some people forward so that you can have some sort of surrender agreement before the battle even starts. Whenever you decided to become a Christian, what was it that you thought it was going to be like? Jesus says, if anyone is not willing to take up his cross and follow me, he's not worthy to come after me. I find this phrase that's embedded in this kind of interesting, because we see sort of the three layers of interpretation embedded in this. You've got three groups of people who hear this message from Jesus to take up your cross. So you have the people that were sitting there in front of it. And what's interesting to me about that group of people they weren't aware at this point that Jesus was going to die on a cross. Now, they understood what it meant for someone to die on a cross. But the relationship between Jesus' crucifixion and taking up the cross would not have been there yet. So understanding what it means to have a life of pain and torment and suffocating to death would have been something that they would have understood, but they wouldn't have necessarily associated with Jesus. Because see, one of the things that is evident to us that may not have been evident to them is that Jesus was willing to do all of this. These were things that he was willing to do himself. He didn't put any stipulation on this for anybody that he wasn't willing to undergo himself. So you got the first group of people who were actually witnesses to Jesus' speech here. You got the second group of people who would have been the original audience, who would have known about Jesus' death. And then you've got the third group, which is us, and now we have all the things that go along with the entirety of the canon and how Jesus' death and its meaning fits into everything. The taking up of the cross is a huge challenge to each of us. Whenever we decide to follow Jesus, do we ask ourselves, am I willing to do for him what he was willing to do for me? Am I willing to give everything up? Am I willing to put down everything else? Am I willing to truly place God as the thing that I put my merit on? Do I care about God and his goals, or do I care about my goals? Jesus concludes this discussion with the discussion of salt. Salt is pretty interesting stuff. I have fond memories of doing a lot of math one night, trying to figure out the infusion rate of 3% sodium chloride for a person who was slowly having a brain herniation. So that's my association with salt. It's really important stuff. Your body uses it for many, almost all of the reactions that occur in it. But salt is a very practical thing. You can use it to purify. You can use it to make things taste better. But if salt isn't able to do what it's supposed to do, it's pretty worthless. Jesus here says that really what you're left with is you take it out and throw it on the manure pile, which, interesting choice of words. He says it's useless. You can't use it on food. You can't use it in the soil. Now, there's a few different theories as to what using it in the soil actually means. Most of the ancient interpreters thought it had something to do with a fertilizer. It's been demonstrated today that you can use it to kill weeds and those sort of things, so maybe it had to do with part of the preparation. But the whole point is, if salt is no longer salt, you can't salt with it. It's not useful. It's not helpful. When you think about salt and how it makes our food taste better, and you can tell whenever it's absent, do you view the way that you impact the world as salt? Our goal should be, as Christians, to make the world a better place than the one that we came into. If we're doing the right things, if we are being the type of people that God wants us to be, we should make the world around us better. We should take the things that are there and we should make them more of whatever it is they are. If you take popcorn, you add salt, you got better popcorn. Amen? Amen. You take, I don't know, caramel, you add salt. You get salted caramel. That's some good stuff. We take families. We add the Christian influence. We have well-salted Christian families. We take our workplace. We add the Christian influence. We have a workplace where people want to be. Do you take your Christian heart? Do you take your Christian influence? Do you take the love that Jesus showed for each and every one of us? And do you use it to make the world around you a place where people want to be more? Do you make our influence something that people want to be a part of? Have you lost your saltiness? I don't think there's any coincidence that the term used here, dung heap, is also similar to an area outside of Jerusalem called Gehenna. Gehenna is the word that we usually translate hell. And it was a dung pile that was constantly burning. And it was an area where you would take things that you need to get rid of, and it was always on fire and would burn it up. The salt that's lost its saltiness is not fit for the kingdom. If you've ever had salt, you let moisture get in it, you probably noticed that a lot of times it'll get caked together, and until you toss it out, you can't really use what's left. In our lives, in the body, we need to make sure that we are people that are making our brothers and sisters better, not brothers and sisters who are impeding. We need to make the world around us better. We need to show Christ's influence. That starts with counting the cost. Ultimately, Bonhoeffer died as a martyr for the purpose of trying to overthrow the Nazi government. Whenever he said, hey, I am going to be what I am preaching, he ended up dying in a way that he thought was congruent with costly grace. Because we live in a 21st century world with 21st century amenities, with a 21st century economy and a 21st century government, a lot of times it's hard for us to understand what it truly means to suffer for Christ. Now, we can have emotional and financial suffering in our lives, but generally, we never have to actually put our lives on the line for the gospel. Imagine what a world would look like, though, if we were willing to do that if the time arose. If our faith was strong enough that we weren't scared of death anymore, if our faith was strong enough that we put God as our one and only, what would it be like whenever we tried to do outreach? What would it be like whenever we tried to talk to people about the gospel? What would it be like whenever we had things and pressures from the outside? I said this, I think it was about a month ago. I am probably going to get thrown in jail at least once during my lifetime. In all likelihood, what I'm doing up here today is at some point not going to be legal. I'm looking for some cellmates. This morning, if you have any need, please come as together we stand as we sing.